The impossible version says the moon sent back a television broadcast from 1938. That is the kind of sentence that sounds like it belongs in a hoax file, or in the margin of a science fiction script. An old image, a vanished program, a signal that should have died in the air above London, returning years later from the cold surface of another world. But the unsettling part is not that the legend is true exactly as told. It is that the pieces around it are real. A BBC television signal from Alexandra Palace, intended for a small audience in and around London, was recorded on Long Island in 1938. The pictures were not clear. They were distorted, fading, unstable, more ghost than broadcast. But they existed. RCA engineers in New York had captured images from the BBC television service across an ocean at a time when the service itself was still young enough to feel experimental. And years later, the moon really did become part of the story of human broadcasting. Not as a memory device, not as a cosmic archive storing television programs in dust and shadow. The moon did not hold a BBC broadcast for decades and then send it home. But in 1946, Project Diana at Camp Evans, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, proved that radio energy could be sent from Earth, reflected from the lunar surface, and detected again after about 2.5 seconds. Decades after that, in December 1978, Sullivan and Knowles used the 305-meter Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico to observe terrestrial radio leakage reflected from the moon. So the contradiction is not a single miracle. It is a chain. A London television signal escaped its expected limits. Engineers on Long Island recorded it. Later, radar pulses touched the moon and came back. Later still, astronomers used the moon as a passive reflector to sample the radio noise of Earth itself, including leakage from television transmitters and military radars. Somewhere between those facts, a legend forms. The moon sent back our first broadcast. The truth is quieter, but it is more interesting. It asks a different question. Not whether the moon remembered us, but how early we began leaking into the sky. In 1938, television was not yet the ordinary domestic presence it would become. It was fragile, local, and often live. A program could pass through a camera, become an electrical signal, rise through an aerial, and vanish as soon as it was transmitted. Unless someone filmed the screen, there might be no surviving trace at all. The image was not a file, not a tape, not an archive object. It was an event in the air. That is why the Long Island recording matters. The surviving clip was made on 16mm film by filming the television image from a screen. It is not a clean relay. It does not look like a signal carried by cable or planned for distribution. It looks like something being lost while it is being found. The fading and distortion are part of the evidence. They tell us the signal had not arrived through ordinary broadcast conditions. It had been carried by unusual long-distance radio propagation, likely involving the ionosphere or related atmospheric and solar conditions. The ionosphere is where the story leaves common sense without leaving physics. A television transmitter near London was not supposed to serve New York. The early BBC television service from Alexandra Palace was built for a small world. Pre-war programs could be seen within about a 25-mile radius of Alexandra Palace. The transmitter mast itself was a 225-foot lattice structure, giving an aerial height of about 460 feet above sea level. It was an impressive installation, but it was not built as a transatlantic beacon. Yet radio waves do not always obey the boundaries that engineers intend for them. Under unusual conditions, the upper atmosphere can bend, refract, or return radio energy in unexpected ways. A signal that should have continued outward or faded beyond the horizon can appear far beyond its planned service area. The result can feel like an intrusion, a local signal arriving where it has no business being. That is what makes the 1938 recording so powerful. It is not evidence of a lunar reflection. It is evidence that the air above Earth was stranger than the map of the broadcast service. The path ran from Alexandra Palace in London to Long Island, New York. On the British side stood the BBC's early television base, often nicknamed Ally Pally. On the American side were RCA engineers who, in 1937 and 1938, built a large receiving setup associated with an antenna about 800 feet long and 150 feet wide. That scale matters. This was not a casual household receiver, accidentally picking up London over breakfast. It was an engineered act of listening, an attempt to catch something that ordinary expectations said should not reliably arrive. The recorded images became a rare artifact because early television was so often temporary. The medium had not yet become a vast machine of repetition and preservation. It was closer to theater with an aerial, a live performance sent outward, watched by a small number of people, then gone. The Long Island film is therefore doubly strange. It preserves not only pre-war British television, but pre-war British television as seen after a journey it was never meant to make. This is where the legend and the science fiction feeling begin to overlap. A signal leaves London. It crosses the Atlantic against expectation. It appears as a degraded image in New York. The same year, radio culture is already haunted by stories of invasion and voices from beyond. On the 30th of October, 1938, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air broadcast their CBS adaptation of The War of the Worlds. That broadcast was separate from the BBC television recording, but the coincidence belongs to the atmosphere of the period. The air itself had become dramatic. Voices could arrive from nowhere. Signals could be mistaken for emergencies. Machines could make distance feel unstable. Then, after the war, the moon entered the story for real. Project Diana did not recover an old program. It did something more foundational. At Camp Evans, on the grounds of Fort Monmouth in New Jersey, U.S. Army Signal Corps engineers modified radar equipment and sent radio pulses toward the moon. On the 10th of January, 1946, at about 11:58 in the morning, the echo came back. IEEE reports the delay at about 2.5 seconds, matching the round-trip light time to the moon. That pause is the sound of distance becoming measurable. A pulse leaves Earth. Silence. Then a weakened return. Not a message from the moon, but a reflection from it. The lunar surface, in that moment, became a mirror for human radio technology. IEEE recognizes Project Diana as marking the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. It showed that Earth could touch another celestial body with radio and hear the contact come back. Decades later, Arecibo added another layer. Sullivan and Knowles used the enormous radio telescope in Puerto Rico to observe terrestrial radio leakage reflected from the lunar surface. They found that military radars and television transmitters were major contributors to Earth's radio leakage in the 150 to 500 megahertz range. In that experiment, the moon was again not a recorder. It was a passive reflector, letting astronomers study Earth by looking at its reflection. So the title of this story contains a trap. The moon did not send back a stored BBC program from 1938, but a BBC signal from 1938 really did cross the Atlantic and become film on Long Island. The moon really did send back human radio energy in 1946, and Arecibo really did detect Earth's own leakage after it reflected from the lunar surface in 1978. Taken together, those facts suggest something more haunting than the myth. From the earliest years of television, Earth was not only watching itself, it was radiating itself. Its entertainments, experiments, military systems, and technical accidents were entering the environment around the planet. Some signals faded quickly. Some bent back through the ionosphere. Some could be bounced from the moon if the equipment was powerful and sensitive enough. Some became clues to what a technological civilization might look like from a distance. The first chapter of that trail does not begin on the moon. It begins above London, on a hill crowned by Alexandra Palace, where the BBC built an experimental television service that was supposed to belong to a city, not an ocean. Before the echoes from space, before Arecibo listened to Earth by looking at the moon, there was a transmitter at Ali Pali, a small audience, and a signal that should not have crossed the sea. To understand why that signal mattered when it escaped London, we have to climb back to the place it escaped from. Alexandra Palace was not built as a spacecraft, or a radar station, or a scientific observatory. It stood on high ground in North London, in London North 22, with the city spread below it. Its nickname, Ali Pali, made it sound almost domestic, almost playful. But in the middle of the 1930s, the eastern part of the building became something stranger, a broadcast fortress on a hill, an experimental engine room for a medium that most people had still never seen. Historic England records the decisive step. In June 1935, the BBC leased the eastern part of Alexandra Palace for the development of high-definition television. That phrase is easy to pass over now because high definition has become a moving target, a promise renewed by every generation of screens. But in the 1930s, it meant something specific and ambitious. It meant television with enough lines, enough stability, and enough regularity to become a public service rather than a laboratory curiosity. It meant taking moving pictures out of demonstrations and exhibitions and placing them onto a schedule. The location was practical, but it was also cinematic. Alexandra Palace already looked down on London. Put a transmitting mast there, and the palace became a kind of lighthouse for images. Not a lighthouse casting a visible beam, but one sending invisible radio energy into the air, carrying faces, scenery, news, variety performances, and studio experiments. From below, the city could see the hill. From the hill, the BBC could attempt to reach the city. This is why Alexandra Palace sits at the beginning of the story. The later mystery depends on the ordinariness of the original intention. The BBC was not trying to reach Long Island. It was not trying to address the moon. It was trying to make television work for a small public in and around London from a permanent base. And yet the architecture of that attempt placed a radio transmitter above the capital at a height and in a position where its signals could enter the larger physical world. On the 2nd of November, 1936, the BBC launched the world's first regular high-definition television service from Alexandra Palace. The word regular matters. There had been television experiments before. There had been demonstrations, rival systems, mechanical ingenuity, and public fascination. But here was a service, something recurring, organized, and institutional. The BBC had taken a medium that still felt like a technical apparition and given it a timetable. Inside the palace, the future was divided into rooms. Studio A used Marconi EMI equipment. Historic England describes 4 Emitron cameras in that installation. These cameras belonged to the electronic television system that would become central to the BBC's early service. Studio B, meanwhile, initially used Baird television equipment. The 2 studios were not merely 2 rooms with different labels. They represented competing routes into the television age. One stood for the Marconi EMI approach. The other carried the legacy of Baird television. For a time, both were housed inside the same high building above London, as though the future had not yet decided which door it intended to use. That is one of the quiet tensions of Alexandra Palace. It was a public broadcasting station, but also a trial ground. It presented programs, but it was still testing the machinery of presentation itself. Viewers saw the apparent surface of television, the performer, the announcer, the image on the screen. Behind that surface were cameras, transmitters, cables, lighting, control rooms, and engineers working at the edge of what could reliably be done. The palace became a place where television stopped being only an invention and started becoming a habit. But the habit was fragile. Early television was not a library of recordings. It was a live act of transmission. A program existed in the studio, was converted into a signal, and passed outward into the air. If no one preserved it by some separate means, it vanished almost as soon as it arrived. The screen glowed, the moment passed, the image was gone. That vanishing quality is essential to the whole story. When we later speak of a surviving 16mm film clip from 1938, made by filming a television image from a screen in the United States, its importance comes from this scarcity. Most early broadcasts were not saved. They were events, not files. They were performances sent into a limited service area, leaving little physical trace. Alexandra Palace was producing a stream of live images that could be seen by the right receiver at the right time, then lost. And yet the BBC's choice of Alexandra Palace gave those images a powerful point of departure. The building's eastern section was adapted to serve a new kind of broadcasting. The studios were placed inside a Victorian structure turned technical stronghold. Above it rose the transmitter mast, a lattice structure that would become part of the silhouette of early television. The precise limits of that signal belong to the next stage of the story, but already the principle is visible. Television was not moving through wires to each home. It was being radiated. The word radiated changes the scale. A theater performance remains in the theater unless someone carries it away. A film print travels as an object. A printed page passes hand to hand. But a broadcast leaves the building in all directions allowed by its aerial, its frequency, its power, and the atmosphere. It is local by design, but physical by nature. Once released, it belongs partly to engineering and partly to the sky. In 1936, this was still new enough to feel uncanny. The BBC could put a performer in a studio at Alexandra Palace, and a viewer elsewhere in the London area could see that performer almost as an apparition, a live moving image arriving through the air. Even before any transatlantic surprise, that was already a kind of everyday science fiction. The city had acquired a hilltop machine for turning presence into waves. The palace's dual studio arrangement also reveals that early television was not inevitable in its final form. It had to be chosen. It had to be compared. It had to be judged under real operating conditions. Studio A and Studio B were not just production spaces. They were arguments made with hardware. The Marconi EMI installation and the Baird television installation embodied different technical answers to the same question. How could moving images be captured, transmitted, and made stable enough for regular public viewing? The BBC's regular service began with that uncertainty still close at hand. A viewer turning toward Alexandra Palace was not simply watching entertainment. They were watching a medium being decided. Each broadcast carried not only the program, but the evidence of a system struggling to prove itself. Lines, contrast, motion, camera sensitivity, studio lighting, and receiver performance all mattered. Television was an image, but it was also a negotiation between machines. This is where the palace becomes more than a location. It becomes the first chamber in the chain that will eventually lead us to Long Island, then to Camp Evans, and later to Arecibo. The chain does not begin with a lunar echo. It begins with institutional confidence in a risky technology. The BBC leased space, built studios, installed rival systems, and committed to regular high-definition television from a hill in London. That commitment created the signals that later behaved in ways their makers did not intend. There is a temptation, when looking backward, to make Alexandra Palace seem quaint, a beloved nickname, early cameras, a small audience, an age before recording became routine. But that softness is misleading. Ally Pally was a serious technical site. It was the place where the BBC tried to stabilize the future. Its eastern rooms contained the apparatus of a new public medium. Its mast made London visible to itself in a new way. It was experimental, but not casual. It was uncertain, but not imaginary. And because it was uncertain, every success had weight. On the 2nd of November, 1936, when regular high-definition television began from Alexandra Palace, the achievement was not merely that pictures could be transmitted. It was that they could be transmitted again tomorrow, and the day after that, as part of a service. The miracle was being disciplined into a schedule. Still, inside the building, the future had not yet fully narrowed. Studio A and Studio B faced the same city with different machines. Marconi MEI and Baird television stood side by side under one roof, each representing a possible path. One system would soon prove stronger for the BBC's needs. The other would recede. But for a brief and consequential period, Alexandra Palace held both possibilities at once, two ways of making images fly, two visions of television waiting to be tested in the air above London. For a short time, Alexandra Palace did not contain one future of television. It contained two. The BBC had placed them almost like rival instruments in a laboratory. In Studio A, the Marconi EMI system was installed, with its electronic method and its 405-line picture. In Studio B, Baird Television worked with a 240-line system, carrying forward a different branch of the early television story. Both were inside the same building. Both were part of the BBC's attempt to decide what regular high-definition broadcasting could actually become. And both were being tested not as private demonstrations, but as the machinery of a public service. That is what made the rivalry consequential. This was not only a contest between companies, or between engineers, or between styles of apparatus. It was a contest over the basic texture of the moving image. How much detail could be sent, how steadily it could be received, how reliably it could be repeated, and whether the illusion of presence could survive the strain of live transmission. In Studio A, the Marconi EMI installation represented the system that would soon define British television. Historic England describes the Marconi EMI Studio A equipment as including 4 Emitron cameras. These were part of an electronic television chain built for a 405-line picture. To modernize, 405 lines may sound modest, but in the context of the middle 1930s, it carried the promise of a sharper, more stable image than earlier systems could provide. The term high definition in that era did not mean what it means now. It meant that television had crossed a threshold, no longer merely a flickering curiosity or a laboratory stunt, but a picture with enough structure to support scheduled programs, faces, gestures, sets, performances, and a public expectation that the image would return at the appointed hour. Across the building, Studio B held the Baird system. John Logie Baird had been central to the public imagination of television in Britain. The Baird name belonged to the earlier drama of making pictures appear at all, of proving that vision could be carried by electrical means. At Alexandra Palace, however, Baird Television's 240-line system faced a severe comparison. The BBC's task was not only to honor invention. It had to choose a system that could endure the ordinary pressure of broadcasting. That pressure was relentless. A broadcast system had to work under heat, timing, lighting, rehearsal, and performance. It had to produce a watchable picture not once, but again and again. It had to transform the strange new act of being televised into something producers, performers, engineers, and viewers could begin to trust. Every weakness mattered because there was no safety net hidden behind the image. Early television was largely live. If a picture failed, the failure happened in public. If a scene passed, it passed for almost everyone forever. This is one of the most important things to hold in mind about Alexandra Palace. The building was not a vault of recordings. It was a place of transmission. Programs went out into the air, and then they were gone. Unlike later television culture, where archives, repeats, videotape, and digital files shape our sense of permanence, the television of the 1930s existed close to the edge of disappearance. The studio lights came up. The cameras watched. The signal left the mast. A small audience saw it, if their receivers were working, and if they were within reach. Then the moment dissolved. The rivalry between Studio A and Studio B therefore took place inside a medium that barely knew how to preserve itself. The evidence of success was often immediate and temporary. A visible picture on a receiver, a stable enough performance, a transmission that completed its scheduled hour. The medium was learning to exist by vanishing. That fragility gives the technical comparison a different emotional weight. 405 lines versus 240 lines was not merely a specification. It was a question of how much reality could be held together before the image broke apart. More lines meant more detail, and detail mattered because television was trying to persuade viewers that they were not just watching an electrical novelty. They were watching people, scenes, events. The eyes of a performer, the outline of a costume, the edge of a set, the movement of a hand. These small visual facts carried the credibility of the whole enterprise. The Marconi EIM system's advantage was not just numerical, though the 405-line picture was a crucial part of it. Its dominance came from the BBC's practical experience during the trial period at Alexandra Palace. Inside the schedule, inside the working demands of a service, the Marconi EMI system proved better suited to the path television was about to take. The Baird system, with its 240 lines, belonged to a competing possibility, but the BBC moved toward the Marconi EMI standard. Studio A's system became the one that endured. There is a quiet drama in that decision. We often imagine technological history as if the winning machine was always destined to win. But inside Alexandra Palace, the future was still under test. The BBC had not simply switched on a finished world. It had invited rival systems into the same palace and asked them to perform under public conditions. The result was a narrowing of possibilities. One route became official. Another became historical. And because this happened at the birth of regular high-definition television, the consequences spread outward. The choice of the Marconi EMI 405-line system shaped what British viewers would come to understand as television itself. It influenced the look, rhythm, and technical assumptions of the service. It also shaped the signal that left Alexandra Palace, the signal that rose from the hill above London and entered the atmosphere as electromagnetic energy. That last point matters for the larger story. The signal that would later become strange in the hands of distant listeners was not a ghostly abstraction. It came from a specific technical world. It came from rooms where cameras had to be aimed, images had to be scanned, transmitters had to be fed, and engineers had to make a fragile system behave as if it were stable. Before any broadcast could escape its expected range, it first had to survive its own machinery. So much of early television depended on acts of discipline. Light had to be controlled. Timing had to be controlled. The relationship between camera, transmitter, and receiver had to be controlled. A live performance had to be fitted to a technology that was still experimental enough to resist confidence. The viewer at home saw the final miracle, a moving image arriving through the air. But behind that image was a chain of vulnerabilities. In that chain, Alexandra Palace was both theater and machine. Its studios made programs, but its apparatus made those programs into radio frequency signals. Its cameras turned light into electrical variation. Its transmitters pushed that variation outward. Its mast gave the signal height. Everything was physical. Everything depended on equipment. The romance of television was carried by metal, glass, power, wiring, aerials, and the constant attention of engineers. The dominance of Marconi EMI did not make the medium invulnerable. It made it workable. That distinction is important. By choosing the more effective system, the BBC helped turn television into a regular service. But even regularity did not mean permanence. The broadcast still lived in the instant. The program still disappeared unless someone, by unusual effort or accident, captured it from a screen. The signal still belonged to the air. This is why the surviving traces of early television feel so rare. They are not simply old media artifacts. They are exceptions to a rule of disappearance. Most of what Alexandra Palace transmitted before the war was not preserved in the way later generations expect. It was seen by a limited audience and then lost. The images were real, but their reality was brief. And yet, brief does not mean powerless. The machines in Studio A and Studio B were built for a service that seemed local, immediate, and perishable. They were meant to send pictures to viewers near London, not to write themselves into the physics of long-distance propagation. But once a television signal leaves the transmitter, it enters a world larger than the studio's intentions. It no longer belongs only to the producers who made the program or the engineers who tuned the equipment. It belongs to the atmosphere, to the behavior of radio waves, to conditions that can sometimes carry energy farther than anyone designed. At Alexandra Palace, the BBC selected the system that could make early television reliable enough to continue. The Marconi EMI 405-line system became dominant because it served that practical need. But reliability inside the palace did not guarantee obedience outside it. The signal still had to climb into the air from a hill above London. It still had to radiate from a mast built for a modest service area. It still had to meet the horizon. And beyond that horizon, where the planned audience ended, the stranger part of the story was waiting. Beyond that horizon, the story stops behaving like a story about television engineering and begins to feel like a story about escape. The BBC television service at Alexandra Palace was not built as a voice for the whole planet. It was not imagined as a transatlantic presence. It was not meant to send pictures into American receivers or to leave behind evidence on film thousands of miles from London. It was a local service, experimental but orderly, radiating from high ground in North London toward an audience that was still small enough to imagine, almost house by house. The scale matters because the later mystery depends on it. At the center of that scale stood the Alexandra Palace mast. It was not a symbolic detail. It was the point where all the work inside the studios became a signal in the air. Historic accounts describe it as a 225-foot lattice mast, rising from the palace roofline and giving the aerial an effective height of about 460 feet above sea level. That height was important. Television at these frequencies depended heavily on line of sight. A transmitting aerial placed high above the surrounding city could reach farther than one buried among rooftops and streets. Alexandra Palace had been chosen in part because it already stood on a hill, looking out over London. The mast made that advantage visible. But even with height, even with the most advanced British television system of its moment, the service had ordinary limits. A pre-war viewer did not tune in from anywhere in Britain and expect the BBC picture to appear. The Cambridge History chapter gives the early service area in plain terms. Programs could be seen within about a 25-mile radius of Alexandra Palace. That was the practical world of early British television. A circle around a hill in North London. A city and its outer edge. A signal meant for homes close enough to receive it, not ships crossing the Atlantic, not laboratories in the United States, not receivers on Long Island. The smallness of that circle is easy to miss now. Modern broadcasting trains us to think in networks, relays, satellites, archives, streaming platforms, global distribution. But in the late 1930s, television was still physical in a more fragile way. It depended on a camera tube in a studio, a transmitter in a building, a mast above a city, and a receiver close enough to catch what was being sent. The image was not yet a universal object. It was a local event. Inside the palace, performers appeared under the hot discipline of the studio. The picture was assembled electronically and sent outward. The broadcast left London as a pattern of radio energy carrying light and motion. For the planned audience, that pattern became faces, scenes, titles, movement. For everyone beyond the service area, it was supposed to become nothing at all. That is the quiet contradiction at the heart of this chapter. The BBC had engineered a small world, but the signal did not fully respect it. A radius of about 25 miles does not reach the Atlantic coast. It does not reach Ireland. It does not reach Newfoundland. It certainly does not reach Long Island, New York. Between Alexandra Palace and the American East Coast lay a route of ocean, curvature, weather, daylight, and darkness, and the complicated upper atmosphere. Conventional expectations put the BBC pictures firmly on the British side of that distance. The transmitter was local. The audience was local. The schedule was local. The physical design of the service made sense only if the signal remained, in practice, close to home. And yet the later record says that in 1938, BBC television pictures from Alexandra Palace were received and recorded in the United States. Not clearly, not beautifully, not as a clean relay from one broadcasting system into another. The surviving evidence is described as distorted and fading. That distortion matters. It is not a flaw in the story. It is part of the evidence. A clean, stable image might suggest a planned connection, a known circuit, a controlled transmission path. A fading, unstable picture points to something more unruly, a signal arriving by conditions that were unusual, temporary, and difficult to command. Before we move to Long Island, we need to remain for a moment with the modesty of London's transmitter, because it makes the American reception stranger. A 225-foot lattice mast is a real structure, an industrial object, a piece of broadcast architecture. But it is not a ladder into space. An aerial height of about 460 feet above sea level is useful for reaching across a metropolitan area. It does not erase the curvature of the Earth. It does not turn a local television station into an intercontinental service. Pre-war television was not shortwave broadcasting, built for great distances. The BBC pictures from Alexandra Palace occupied a world in which ordinary reception was expected near the transmitter, inside that limited circle around North London. The people who watched those programs before the war were participating in something rare. They were not part of a mass television nation yet. They were inside the first thin boundary of a new medium. To receive the BBC television service was to be close enough to the source, close enough to the hill, close enough to the mast. The signal did not belong to everyone. It belonged to the small geography that could catch it. That is why the transatlantic appearance feels almost like a breach in the walls of the medium. The route from Alexandra Palace to Long Island was not a cable route in this event. It was not a film shipment. It was not a later reconstruction. It was a radio path, and the fact that such a path opened at all is what gives the episode its tension. Somewhere between London and New York, the signal met conditions that allowed it to travel far beyond its ordinary horizon. Later chapters will name the more grounded explanation unusual long-distance propagation involving the ionosphere or related atmospheric and solar conditions. But at this point in the story, what matters is the mismatch. A small service area, a vast ocean, a television picture that should have dissolved into distance. The ionosphere, though not yet our main subject, is already waiting above the scene. It is the layer of the story that makes the impossible physical. Radio waves do not travel through an empty diagram. They move through an atmosphere that changes with solar conditions, time of day, season, frequency, and disturbances that engineers could observe but not always command. Under ordinary circumstances, the Alexandra Palace television signal had a defined practical reach. Under extraordinary circumstances, that definition could fail. This is the difference between design and reality. The BBC could design for a London area audience. It could build a mast, schedule programs, choose a system, and define a service. It could place Alexandra Palace at the center of a new kind of broadcasting. But once the transmission left the aerial, the signal entered a larger natural system. It became subject to the physics of propagation. It could weaken, scatter, bend, vanish, or, on rare occasions, appear somewhere no ordinary service map would have predicted. That is what makes the phrase service area feel so fragile in this story. A service area is an intention drawn onto geography. It is a promise of reasonable reception, not a wall. The BBC's pre-war service radius tells us what the system was meant to do. The Long Island recording tells us what the atmosphere, on at least one strange occasion, allowed it to do. In the late 1930s, this would have been a profoundly unstable kind of evidence. Early television already vanished too easily. Most programs were live. They passed through the apparatus and disappeared. Recording television from a screen onto film was possible, but not yet a routine archival habit that preserved everything. So when a distant, distorted image survived, it carried more than entertainment. It became a trace of a signal outside its expected world. Imagine the contrast without inventing more than the facts allow. In London, a mast above Alexandra Palace sends out a program for viewers within about 25 miles. The service is still young. The audience is small. The medium is experimental, scheduled, local. Across the Atlantic, engineers are preparing equipment not because the signal is expected in any ordinary domestic sense, but because the edge cases of radio sometimes reward patience. Between those 2 points, the ocean seems to insist on impossibility. But radio history is full of events that begin at the edge of the expected. The Alexandra Palace mast stood over London as part of a system meant to make television reliable, regular, and public. Its purpose was not secrecy or exploration. It was broadcasting. A program made in the palace was supposed to become a domestic image in nearby homes, a flickering new presence in the room. That humble purpose is what makes the later journey so haunting. The signal that crossed the Atlantic did not begin as a message for the world. It began as local television. And because it was local, its escape becomes more meaningful. This is not yet the moon. It is not yet Project Diana. It is not yet Arecibo using the lunar surface as a passive reflector. The moon will enter the story later, as a real mirror for radio waves, and as proof that Earth's transmissions can reach beyond Earth and return. Here, the mirror is not lunar. The boundary being crossed is atmospheric and geographic. The medium is learning that its edges are less certain than its engineers intended. So the picture sharpens into a paradox. A mast of 225 feet. An aerial about 460 feet above sea level. A television service visible under normal pre-war conditions within about a 25-mile radius of Alexandra Palace. These are not the dimensions of a global broadcast. They are the dimensions of an early local experiment, carefully made and narrowly received. Yet somewhere in 1938, that narrow experiment left evidence on the far side of the Atlantic. To understand how anyone was ready to catch it, we have to leave the hill in North London and cross to New York. There, on Long Island, RCA engineers had built something very different from an ordinary television receiver. It was large, deliberate, and patient, an antenna associated with a span of about 800 feet by 150 feet, waiting for a London signal that the normal map of broadcasting said should not arrive. The antenna on Long Island belonged to the same story as the mast at Alexandra Palace, but it felt like its opposite. In North London, the BBC signal had been sent from a hilltop for a small and practical purpose, to reach the new television sets within ordinary range of the capital. On Long Island, RCA engineers were not thinking like ordinary viewers. They were not sitting in a parlor, waiting for an evening program to settle onto a domestic screen. They were building an instrument of pursuit. The Early Television Museum describes the receiving setup associated with RCA's work in 1937 and 1938 as enormous by the standards of television reception, an antenna about 800 feet long and 150 feet wide, built to receive BBC transmissions from London. Those dimensions changed the emotional scale of the event. This was not a chance household discovery, not someone turning a dial at random and finding Britain in the static. It was a deliberate attempt to make a very weak, very unlikely signal visible. An antenna that large asks us to imagine early television not as furniture, but as landscape. 800 feet is not a detail that disappears into engineering notes. It is a length you walk. It is longer than many city blocks. 150 feet wide gives the structure a breadth that belongs more to fields and industrial yards than to the living room imagination of television. Before the screen became small, familiar, and private, the act of catching a picture from across the ocean required space. It required metal, alignment, patience, and the willingness to listen where common expectation said there should be nothing. The route was simple to describe and difficult to believe. From Alexandra Palace in London, a television transmission climbed away from the mast that had been built for a local audience. It left the eastern part of a building the BBC had leased for high-definition television development. It carried images made by a service that, under normal conditions, belonged to London and its surrounding area. Then, under unusual circumstances, some part of that signal crossed the Atlantic and reached the east coast of the United States. Long Island became the far shore of an accident waiting to happen. The word accident matters here, but it has to be used carefully. RCA's engineers were not accidentally interested in London. Their receiving apparatus was built with intention. The antenna was associated specifically with efforts to capture BBC transmissions from Alexandra Palace. The accident lay in the behavior of the medium itself. The signal was not supposed to be a regular oceanic service. The BBC had not designed its pre-war television operation as a global broadcaster. Conventional range expectations did not place London television on American screens. And yet the engineers prepared as if the impossible might have a schedule. That is what gives this chapter of the story its quiet suspense. We are not yet at the moon. We are not yet at radar astronomy or deliberate lunar reflection. We are still on Earth, still inside the unruly physics of the atmosphere, still before the moment when Project Diana would prove that radio energy could be aimed at another world and heard on return. But already the story has taken on the shape of a cosmic experiment. A signal leaves one horizon. An instrument waits beyond another. Between them is a distance that should have ended the matter. The Long Island antenna was, in that sense, a question built out of metal. Could a television transmission escape its intended world? Could a picture meant for a small service area around London appear in America? Could the air above the earth, under rare conditions, become less like a barrier and more like a strange corridor? The answer, preserved by what followed, was yes. But the yes was not clean. It did not arrive like a dependable program feed. It came in distortion, fading, and instability. It came as evidence that something had traveled, not as proof that television had suddenly become transatlantic in any ordinary sense. That distinction is important because early television history can easily be made too smooth in hindsight. We know what television became. We know the later certainty of networks, satellites, relays, videotape, archives, and global live events. But in 1937 and 1938, television was still fragile. At Alexandra Palace, programs often existed only in the moment of transmission. If they were not filmed from a screen or otherwise captured by special means, they vanished as soon as the signal passed. To receive television at all was already to participate in something temporary. To receive it across the Atlantic was to catch an event that should have dissolved long before it reached you. The RCA engineers on Long Island occupied that boundary between planned engineering and unexpected nature. Their equipment was not magical. It did not defeat distance by force. It waited for conditions in which the Earth itself might bend the rules of reception. Later, the explanation would point toward unusual, long-distance propagation through the ionosphere, or related atmospheric and solar conditions. But from the point of view of the receiving station, before the recovered images could be studied as evidence, the scene is easier to feel than to calculate, a vast antenna held open toward the sky, trying to hear London through a continent of air and water. There is something almost cinematic in the contrast. Alexandra Palace stood above London, a landmark turned laboratory, sending high-definition television into the night of the late 1930s. Across the Atlantic, on Long Island, RCA's apparatus occupied another kind of experimental landscape, stretched out not to transmit, but to receive. One side was performance, studios, cameras, programs, faces, motion. The other side was vigilance, wires, receivers, engineers, and a screen waiting for coherence. Between them lay the North Atlantic, dark and indifferent. No one needed the moon to make this feel uncanny. The real geography was strange enough. A local British television signal, engineered for a limited service area, appeared in the United States because radio waves do not always obey the clean circles drawn on coverage maps. The familiar broadcast model says that a transmitter serves its planned audience and then fades beyond usefulness. The atmosphere sometimes answers with a different model: reflection, bending, skipping, escape. The Long Island antenna was built for that possibility, not for a fantasy of stored messages returning from space, but for the measurable chance that a signal from London might reach farther than it had any right to reach under ordinary assumptions. It was an act of technical skepticism in reverse. Rather than dismiss the unlikely, the engineers prepared a receiver large enough to test it. The scale of the apparatus also tells us something about the weakness of the expected signal. If the BBC transmission had been strong and routine on the far side of the Atlantic, no such dramatic receiving arrangement would be necessary. The antenna's size implies the difficulty. It implies loss, fading, and the need to collect what little energy might arrive. It suggests that the engineers were not expecting a polished broadcast, but searching for traces. A trace, in early television, could still be astonishing. A faint synchronizing image, a distorted face, a flicker of studio light from London appearing in America, these were not just technical curiosities. They were signs that the new medium had a hidden geography. Television was supposed to be visual and local, bound to the screen and the service area. Radio propagation made it atmospheric and unstable. It turned the picture into a traveler. This is why the Long Island station matters in the larger arc of the story. The popular version wants the moon to be the source of the mystery, a silent recorder returning a forgotten broadcast. The historical path is more interesting because it is layered. First, Earth's own atmosphere allows a local television signal to overrun its expected boundary. Then, after the war, human engineers deliberately bounce radar from the moon. Decades later, Arecibo listens to Earth's radio leakage reflected from the lunar surface. The moon does enter the story, but not here. In 1938, the crucial reflector is not a lunar surface. It is the unstable upper air and the conditions that allowed a signal from London to find Long Island. Still, the mood of moonbounce is already present. There is a sending station. There is an impossible distance. There is a receiving instrument waiting in silence. There is a delay between intention and discovery. There is the unsettling sense that human transmissions do not simply end where their makers expect them to end. For the engineers, the act of reception would have been practical, technical, and immediate. The apparatus either found usable energy or it did not. The screen either resolved into something recognizable or it collapsed back into noise. But for us, looking back through the evidence, the Long Island antenna becomes a threshold. On one side is broadcasting as a local service. On the other side is broadcasting as leakage, escape, and planetary signature. That shift is subtle, but profound. A television program made for London could become an object of transatlantic detection. A service designed around a modest radius could leave a mark thousands of miles away. A signal that should not arrive could arrive just long enough to be recorded. And that recording is where the story becomes material. The antenna could wait. The receiver could catch. The engineers could watch the unstable image form and disappear. But unless someone preserved what appeared on the screen, the event would vanish like so much early television vanished: live, transmitted, received, and gone. What survived was not a pristine relay from Alexandra Palace. It was something more fragile and, in some ways, more powerful. A 16mm film record made by photographing the television image from a screen. The pictures were distorted and fading, but that is exactly why they matter. They carry the signature of the journey. They are not merely images from London. They are images that crossed farther than they were meant to cross, reached a waiting antenna on Long Island, and became a ghost on film before the signal disappeared again. The ghost on film is easy to misunderstand because it looks so small beside the scale of the claim. A signal leaves Alexandra Palace in North London. It crosses the Atlantic by means that normal service maps could not explain. It reaches RCA engineers on Long Island in 1938. And then, at the critical moment, the evidence is not preserved as a clean electrical recording, not stored as a broadcast master, not captured with the confidence of a modern archive. It is filmed from a screen. That detail matters. The surviving record is a 16mm film clip. It was made by pointing a motion picture camera at the television image itself, recording what appeared on the face of the receiver. The film did not capture the original program at its source. It captured the received image after its long, unstable journey. In that sense, the clip is not just a record of British television. It is a record of reception. It shows the signal as an event. For early television, this was already unusual. The BBC television service before the war was a live medium. Programs were transmitted, watched, and then, in most cases, lost. There was no ordinary domestic videotape recorder waiting under the set. There was no routine system by which every live broadcast from Alexandra Palace was automatically saved for future historians. Television in the late 1930s still belonged to a world of immediacy. The image existed while the cameras were active, while the transmitters were radiating, while the receiver could hold the signal. Then it vanished. That is why the Long Island film is so important. Its value is not only that it crossed an ocean. Its value is that it survived at all. The film is a form of accidental archaeology. It gives later viewers something rare, a glimpse of pre-war British television as it appeared on a screen. Not as a script, not as a still photograph from a studio, not as a technical diagram of the Marconi EMI system or the Alexandra Palace mast. It is a moving remnant of the actual television image, received far outside the ordinary world for which the service had been designed. And it is not beautiful in the way a restoration might be beautiful. The pictures are distorted. They fade. They weaken and return. They seem to struggle to remain visible, as if the image is being pulled between presence and disappearance. There is no sense of a stable, engineered relay, no feeling that London and Long Island were joined by a clean, dependable circuit. What survives looks more like a signal at the edge of possibility. That is exactly what gives the film its authority. A perfect image would be easier to admire, but it would also be easier to misread. A perfect image might suggest a planned link, a tested transatlantic television circuit, a route under control. The surviving 16mm record suggests the opposite. Its instability is part of the evidence. The fading and distortion tell us that the engineers were not receiving a normal broadcast under normal conditions. They were watching a signal that had escaped the limits expected for it, arrived with damage written into it, and then only briefly held together long enough to be photographed. The film is therefore not a window opened cleanly from New York to London. It is a trace left by turbulence. The camera that filmed the screen added one more layer of distance. First, there was the live television performance, or program, from Alexandra Palace. Then the radio frequency signal moved outward from the transmitter in London. Then it followed an unusual path far beyond the intended service area. Then it was caught by the Long Island receiving apparatus. Then it became a television image again, on a screen. Only then did the 16mm camera turn that unstable glow into film. Every stage left its mark. The original image had already passed through early television technology, through the limitations of transmission, propagation, reception, display, and photographic copying. By the time it reached the film, it was no longer just a program. It was a layered artifact of the entire chain. The distortions were not flaws to be ignored. They were the texture of the event. This is why the word ghost feels appropriate, even in a story that must stay close to physics. The film is not supernatural. It does not show an image stored in space and returned by some cosmic memory. It does not prove that the moon held a broadcast from 1938 and later sent it home. But it does show something that feels haunted, because early television itself was so often unrecorded. The screen once glowed, someone filmed it, and nearly everything around it disappeared. The ordinary transmissions, the live hours, the countless images that never became archives. What remains is a faint, moving survival from a medium that was still learning how to leave evidence. There is a strange intimacy in that. The BBC service at Alexandra Palace was built in the language of high-definition television for its time, with engineers, studios, cameras, transmitters, and schedules. Yet, the surviving transatlantic proof comes to us as something handmade and provisional, a film camera aimed at a screen. It is a modern image, captured by an older medium. Television, still too young to preserve itself reliably, had to borrow cinema's material memory. 16mm film gave the fugitive image a body. Once the picture was on film, it could be handled, stored, projected, copied, and studied. It no longer depended on the momentary cooperation of receiver and atmosphere. The long-distance signal could collapse again. The evidence no longer collapsed with it. A broadcast intended for a small audience around London had become a strip of physical material in the United States. That transformation is quiet but profound. Radio waves are events in motion. Film is an object. One belongs to propagation, the other to preservation. The Long Island recording sits precisely at the point where the moving signal became a surviving artifact. It also changes what we can say about early television history. Without such fragments, pre-war live television would be known largely through institutional records, technical descriptions, press accounts, and photographs. Those sources matter, but they do not show the living screen in quite the same way. A filmed television image preserves movement, framing, brightness, instability, and the experience of watching a picture being held together electronically. In the Long Island case, it preserves something still rarer, not merely how Alexandra Palace television looked, but how it looked after being received across the Atlantic under extraordinary conditions. That distinction is essential. The clip should not be treated as a clean sample of what an ordinary London viewer saw. It is not a faithful domestic reception within the expected 25-mile service radius. It is a damaged survivor from an abnormal path. The fading is not incidental. The distortion is not just inconvenience. These are signs that the signal was living at the margins of reception. The screen image was being shaped by instability before the film camera ever saw it. This is where the cinematic temptation has to be resisted. It would be easy to imagine the transmission as a beam, straight and purposeful, crossing the ocean like a message in a science fiction film. It would be easy to treat the surviving pictures as though they were delivered by some precise invisible bridge. But the evidence points to a less orderly and more interesting reality. The signal did not arrive as a polished relay. It arrived as something intermittent, weak, and altered. That makes the event more believable, not less. The imperfect image is the fingerprint of the physical world interfering with expectation. If a local television service from London could appear on Long Island, it would not do so as though it had been planned by broadcasters. It would arrive wounded by the journey. It would fade. It would distort. It would behave like a signal that had found a rare opening through conditions not designed for human schedules. The film lets us see that. It is not simply an illustration for the story. It is one of the reasons the story can be told with care. The surviving 16mm clip anchors the account in material evidence, a screen photographed in 1938 showing BBC television pictures from Alexandra Palace as received in the United States. It confirms that the event was not only an engineering anecdote or a rumor passed among enthusiasts. Something appeared. Someone recorded it. The record endured. And yet the film also warns us against exaggeration. Its ghostly quality may invite cosmic explanations, but the pictures themselves speak of unstable reception, not lunar return. They do not look like a message sent back by the moon after a delay. They look like a terrestrial broadcast that has been bent into an unlikely path, weakened by distance, and caught at the edge of disappearance. That is the balance at the center of this chapter of the story. The clip is extraordinary, but it does not need to become impossible. Its power comes from the fact that it is real and fragile at the same time. It belongs to London and Long Island, to the BBC and RCA, to live television and motion picture film, to a small service area and a transatlantic anomaly. The moon will enter this story in its proper place, with echoes measured in seconds and experiments designed to touch the lunar surface with radio. But this ghost from 1938 asks for a different explanation. Not a memory in the moon. Not a broadcast stored in space. Something closer to Earth and stranger in its own way. The upper atmosphere, changing the rules of distance. The upper atmosphere is where the story becomes less like folklore and more like a difficult piece of physics. After the 16-millimeter ghost, it is tempting to let the imagination keep traveling outward. A picture leaves London. It vanishes from ordinary range. It appears on Long Island. The title of the larger mystery seems to pull the moon into the path, as if the signal had struck the lunar surface, lingered there somehow, and then returned as a delayed memory. But the surviving evidence from 1938 asks us to stay much closer to Earth. The BBC television signal received by RCA engineers on Long Island was not a lunar reflection. It was not moon bounce. It was not an old broadcast thrown back by a silent, cratered mirror. The moon would later become part of this wider story, and in a very real way. Radio pulses would be sent toward it. Echoes would return. Decades later, astronomers would use the lunar surface as a passive reflector to study Earth's own radio leakage. But the transatlantic television reception from Alexandra Palace belongs to a different physical mechanism. The best explanation is unusual long-distance radio propagation through the ionosphere, or through related atmospheric and solar conditions that temporarily changed how far a signal could travel. That correction matters because it does not make the event smaller. It makes it real. The ordinary expectation for the Alexandra Palace television service was local. Its mast rose above North London, and the intended audience was in and around the capital, not across the ocean. Pre-war programs could be seen within about a 25-mile radius of Alexandra Palace. That limit was not a failure. It was part of what the service was. Early high-definition television, in the British sense of the period, was a fragile urban experiment, a transmitter, a mast, a schedule, a small number of receivers, and a signal that usually lived and died in the air over London. Yet radio waves do not always obey the neat circles drawn on service maps. Between the ground and space, there is a region shaped by sunlight, charged particles, and the electrical state of the upper atmosphere. The ionosphere is not a solid roof. It is not a polished shell. It is a shifting medium, and its conditions vary with time of day, season, solar activity, and the behavior of the atmosphere itself. Under ordinary circumstances, very high-frequency television signals tend to travel mostly by line of sight. They do not bend generously around the curvature of Earth. They do not normally cross an ocean from a London hilltop to a receiver in New York. But under unusual conditions, signals can be bent, refracted, or returned along paths far beyond their expected horizon. That is the physical twist in the 1938 reception. Not magic, not stored time, not a message from the moon, but the upper atmosphere briefly becoming part of the circuit. The path is important to imagine carefully. A signal from Alexandra Palace leaves the transmitting aerial above London. It spreads outward, carrying the live television picture of the BBC service. Most of that energy is lost into space or absorbed into the ordinary noise of the world. But some of it, under rare propagation conditions, can be guided or bent in a way that carries it over a distance no television planner would have offered to the public as reliable service. Across the Atlantic, on Long Island, RCA engineers had built a receiving system deliberately large enough to test that unlikely possibility. When the conditions aligned, a signal that should have faded into uselessness became just strong enough to form an image. Not a stable image. Not a clean image. A distorted and fading image. That is why the film record is so persuasive. If the Long Island reception had looked like a perfect broadcast chain, the story would feel almost too smooth. Instead, the pictures behave like something caught at the edge of physics. They warp. They weaken. They come and go. The image filmed from the television screen does not look like the output of a carefully engineered relay. It looks like a signal that has survived a difficult passage. The ionosphere gives that passage a plausible landscape. In a cinematic version of the story, it is easy to picture the moon as the only object grand enough to explain the distance. The mind wants a visible body, a target, a reflector hanging in the night. But the real agent was more elusive, an invisible, variable layer above the weather, sensitive to the sun, able under the right circumstances to redirect energy that was never meant to make such a journey. This is the difference between a mythic explanation and a scientific one. The myth says the moon remembered. The physics says the atmosphere bent. And the physics is stranger in its own quiet way. The ionosphere does not preserve a program. It does not hold a broadcast for years. It does not behave like a recording medium. What it can do under certain conditions is alter the path of radio waves while they are still moving. The 1938 BBC signal was not waiting somewhere to be found later. It was received in its own moment, across a route made briefly possible by the state of the atmosphere and the sun. That immediacy changes the emotional shape of the event. The ghost on film is not a message delayed by decades. It is a live signal that escaped its local world and arrived almost impossibly far away, while the program was still part of the present tense. It was not old when RCA caught it. It became old because the film survived. The correction also protects the later moon story from confusion. When Project Diana succeeded in 1946, it would be doing something fundamentally different. That experiment at Camp Evans, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, sent radar energy outward, deliberately aimed at the moon, and detected a returning echo after about 2.5 seconds. The delay mattered. It was the round-trip light time made audible, a pause long enough to prove that the signal had traveled to another world and back. That was a true lunar reflection. The 1938 BBC reception had no such lunar delay at the center of it. It was not designed as a moon experiment. It did not depend on the lunar surface. The RCA engineers were not catching an echo from space. They were receiving a terrestrial broadcast that had found an abnormal terrestrial route. Later still, in December 1978, Sullivan and Knowles would use the 305-meter Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico to observe terrestrial radio leakage reflected from the lunar surface. In that case, the moon really did serve as a passive reflector. Earth's own emissions, including contributions from television transmitters and military radars, could be sampled after bouncing from the lunar surface. That later work showed that the planet leaks radio evidence of itself. It helped make Earth seem, from a radio point of view, like an object that could be detected by its unintended transmissions. But even there, the moon was not a memory device. It was a mirror, and a weak one. It reflected what reached it. It did not store Alexandra Palace in its dust. So the story has to hold two truths at once. First, the moon did become a genuine participant in the history of radio signals, echoes, and planetary leakage. Second, the Long Island recording of the BBC in 1938 was not one of those lunar events. It was an ionospheric event, or at least an atmospheric and solar propagation event, in which Earth's own upper layers opened a rare, long-distance path. That may sound like a narrowing of the mystery, but it is really a deepening of it. The impossible does not become ordinary just because it becomes explainable. A local television service from Alexandra Palace, made for a small viewing area around London, still appeared across the Atlantic. RCA's antenna still caught pictures that should not have been available in any routine sense. A live British television image still became a fragile American film record before much of early television had learned how to preserve itself at all. The difference is that now the wonder has a structure. There is London, with its transmitter. There is the Atlantic, too wide for ordinary service. There is Long Island, with its patient receiving equipment. And between them, not a straight line, but a changing sky, a charged, unsettled region where the sun's influence and Earth's atmosphere could briefly turn a local broadcast into a transoceanic signal. This was the radio age at its most unstable and revealing. People were learning that the air was not empty. It carried voices, music, pictures, warnings, experiments, and sometimes misunderstandings. Signals could arrive from places they were not expected. A receiver could make the distance seem immediate. A technical anomaly could feel, to anyone without the full explanation, like an intrusion from another world. That same year, 1938, another broadcast would turn the uncertainty of radio into drama. It was not connected to the BBC television reception, and it should not be folded into the same event. But it belonged to the same atmosphere of belief, a culture listening to the air, imagining invasion, and discovering how powerful a signal could become once it entered the human mind. The same atmosphere that made a distant television signal feel uncanny also made radio drama unusually powerful. By 1938, listeners had learned to live with invisible arrivals. A voice could enter a kitchen from another city. Music could appear without a musician in the room. News could come through a speaker before a newspaper could be printed. The air had become a medium of ordinary life, but it had not become fully domesticated. It still felt mysterious enough that a signal could seem almost like an event in itself. That is why the other famous broadcast of that year belongs beside the Long Island reception, even though it does not belong inside it. On the 30th of October, 1938, CBS aired the Mercury Theater on the Air adaptation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. It was directed and performed by Orson Welles. It was not a BBC television transmission. It did not come from Alexandra Palace. It was not recorded by RCA engineers as a distorted picture from London. It was not evidence of ionospheric propagation, and it was not part of the transatlantic television experiment. But culturally, it stands in the same weather. The Mercury Theater broadcast turned the medium itself into part of the story. The subject was invasion from Mars, but the deeper instrument was belief, what a listener thought was coming through the air, and how quickly imagination could fill the space between signal and certainty. In the world of 1938, the radio receiver was not only an appliance. It was a threshold. It sat in the room and made elsewhere audible. That elsewhere might be a studio. It might be a concert hall. It might be a news source. It might be, in fiction, another world. This is the quiet connection between the CBS drama and the BBC television ghost. One was art. One was engineering. One was staged for an American radio audience. One was an accidental survival of pre-war British television received on Long Island. Yet both depended on the same new condition of modern life. The public had begun to trust invisible transmission. People arranged their evenings around signals. They made broadcasters part of the household. They accepted that important realities could arrive without physical presence. The War of the Worlds did not need to prove that radio waves could cross an ocean in unexpected ways. It needed only the cultural fact that radio already felt immediate. A voice from a speaker could have authority because the speaker had become a familiar point of contact with the world. If a program imagined alien signals, invasion, and catastrophe, it was drawing on a medium that had already trained its audience to receive the unseen as real. The BBC television reception on Long Island sits on the technical side of that same transformation. Alexandra Palace had been built into a broadcasting outpost above London, sending pictures intended for a limited service area. The RCA engineers were listening, or more precisely watching, with equipment built for an unusual task. When the signal arrived in 1938, distorted and fading, it showed that the physical reach of broadcasting could be stranger than the official service maps suggested. The CBS broadcast showed something else. The psychological reach of broadcasting could be just as strange. It is important not to blur those two meanings. The Long Island recording was a physical event, dependent on radio propagation and atmospheric conditions. The Mercury Theater program was a dramatic event, dependent on performance, adaptation, and the habits of listening. One moved through the ionosphere. The other moved through expectation. But both reveal why this period is so easy to mythologize. The late 1930s were filled with signals whose sources were real, but whose effects were not always predictable. The phrase coming through the air had begun to carry a double meaning. It described a technical process, the transmission of electromagnetic energy from one point to another. But it also described an emotional experience. Something unseen came into the room. It had no body, but it had presence. It could be scheduled, yet it could still feel sudden. It could be familiar, yet it could carry a story about the utterly unfamiliar. That is why H.G. Wells's older imagination found such force in Orson Welles's radio-era adaptation. The idea of Martian invasion belonged to science fiction, but the means of delivery belonged to modern broadcasting. The drama did not arrive as a printed page held at a safe distance. It arrived as sound, in time, with the authority and intimacy of the medium. It demonstrated that the radio age had not merely invented new machines. It had created new states of attention. And this matters for the larger story of the moon and the lost broadcast because myth often begins at the place where technical wonder and cultural fear overlap. A television signal appears where it should not. A radio drama imagines an invasion from the sky. Later,
Real engineers will send radar energy to the moon and detect the return.
Later still, astronomers will use the moon as a passive reflector to study Earth's own radio leakage. Seen too quickly, these events collapse into one legend, old broadcasts wandering through space, returning like messages from a cosmic archive. But the real history is more precise and more interesting. In 1938, the moon was not sending back the BBC. The moon was not storing television. The Long Island pictures were not a lunar echo. The evidence points back toward Earth's upper atmosphere, toward unusual propagation, toward the ways solar and atmospheric conditions could bend expectations. At the same time, the imagination of the radio public was already looking outward. The War of the Worlds gave that imagination a famous form, the signal as warning, the receiver as witness, the sky as a possible source of danger. The year becomes haunting, not because one event explains the other, but because they illuminate the same threshold. Broadcasting had made distance porous. A signal could cross a city, a nation, an ocean. It could carry information, entertainment, fiction, misunderstanding. It could be measured by engineers and misread by audiences. It could be a trace on film or a voice in a room. It could make the faraway feel local. The instability was not a failure of the medium. It was part of its power. By placing the CBS drama beside the BBC reception, we can see 1938 as a year when the air itself seemed newly charged with possibility. The machines were still young. Television was fragile and mostly live. Radio was mature enough to be trusted, but mysterious enough to be feared. Science fiction was not separate from this world of transmitters and receivers. It was one of the ways people made sense of it. The imagined Martian signal and the real London television signal never touched. They belonged to different networks, different institutions, different purposes. Yet they both remind us that before humanity deliberately bounced a signal off the moon, broadcasting had already changed the meaning of space. The room was no longer sealed from the horizon. The horizon was no longer the limit of arrival. The sky was becoming part of the circuit. To find the true lunar echo, the story has to leave the cultural electricity of 1938 and move forward into a different kind of experiment. Not a drama of invasion. Not a fragile television image bent across the Atlantic. A deliberate pulse aimed outward from New Jersey toward the moon itself. The deliberate pulse begins where the imagined invasion ends, not in a theater of voices, not in a living room suddenly frightened by fiction, but on the grounds of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, at a place called Camp Evans. By then, the strange lesson of broadcasting had already been learned. Signals did not always behave like private messages. They escaped. They bent. They crossed distances their builders had not quite intended. A television picture meant for the London region could reach RCA engineers on Long Island under unusual conditions. A radio drama on CBS could make the invisible air feel charged with possibility. But those were still events inside Earth's envelope. Transmitters, listeners, atmosphere, culture, fear. Project Diana changed the scale. It did not return an old broadcast from the moon. It did not recover a vanished program from 1938. It did not prove that the lunar surface could store human voices and play them back like a record. That is the mythic version, the version the mind wants because it gives the moon a memory. The real achievement was quieter and more important. At Camp Evans, engineers showed that radio energy could leave Earth, travel across the space between worlds, strike the moon, and be detected again on Earth. The moon was not a recorder. It was not an archive. It was a distant, pale reflector, a passive body in space, receiving a human-made pulse and sending back only the faintest trace of it. That faint trace was enough. Project Diana belongs to the period just after the Second World War, when wartime radar knowledge was being carried into a new and uncertain technological future. Camp Evans, on the grounds of Fort Monmouth, was part of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, world of antennas, radar laboratories, calculations, and experimental communications. The tools had been made for a planet at war, but in New Jersey, those tools were turned toward an object beyond the planet. The target was the moon. There is something almost startlingly simple about the idea when stated plainly. Send a radio pulse upward. Wait. If the pulse is strong enough, if the receiving system is sensitive enough, if the calculations are right, if the moon is where the instruments expect it to be, then a small portion of that energy may come back. But the simplicity is deceptive. The moon is not a nearby wall. It is a world in orbit, far enough away that even light needs time to make the journey. A radio wave travels at light speed, but light speed does not make the moon immediate. It makes the distance measurable. It turns space into a pause. That pause would become the signature of Project Diana. Before we arrive at the first successful echo, it is worth holding the experiment in its proper place in the story. The 1938 BBC reception on Long Island was a surprise. It was a signal leaving its expected service area and arriving where it was not supposed to appear. The explanation belonged to the ionosphere and unusual propagation, to the upper atmosphere changing the practical rules of radio range. Project Diana was different. It was not accidental reception. It was not a television image caught by chance on a screen and preserved on 16mm film. It was not a ghost from one country appearing in another. It was a designed experiment, built around a specific question. Could Earth make contact with the moon by radio and recognize the return? That question marks the turn from broadcasting as expansion to broadcasting as reach. For decades, radio had already made geography feel porous. A signal could cross a city, a coastline, an ocean. But Project Diana asked whether radio could cross the boundary that mattered most, the boundary between Earth and another celestial body. Not metaphorically, not as fiction, not as a dramatic premise, physically. This is why IEEE recognizes Project Diana as marking the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. The wording matters. Radar astronomy means using transmitted radio energy to study bodies beyond Earth, rather than only receiving what the universe happens to send. Space communications means that radio is not merely a terrestrial medium. It can become a bridge across space. At Camp Evans, those two futures touched at once. The experiment was named Project Diana, after the Roman goddess of the moon. The name carries a trace of mythology, but the work itself was engineering. It belonged to instruments, arrays, radar equipment, timing, and signal detection. In the IEEE account, the project used modified SCR radar equipment and an antenna array made from half-wave dipoles and reflectors. Those details will matter more as we come closer to the machine itself, because the achievement was not simply a poetic gesture toward the sky. It depended on hardware adapted for a task that had never before been proven in this way. The people attached to the project also bring it out of legend and into documented history. IEEE names John H. DeWitt Jr., E. King Stadola, Jacob Moffsensen, Harold D. Webb, and Herbert Kaufman among the key personnel. The U.S. Army also identifies physicist Walter S. McAfee as the scientist whose theoretical calculations helped determine whether the moon bounce was feasible. That fact is important because the echo had to exist first as a possibility on paper. Before anyone could hear the moon answer, someone had to show that the returning signal would not be too weak, too scattered, too far below detection to matter. A lunar echo is not a dramatic reflection like a shout returning from a canyon. Most of the energy sent toward the moon does not come neatly back to the sender. Space spreads it. The lunar surface reflects it weakly. The received echo is a remnant, a fragment, a whisper of the original pulse. To detect it, the experimenters needed more than confidence. They needed a path through the numbers. That is one of the quiet tensions of Project Diana. It sits between certainty and impossibility. The moon is visible to anyone who looks up on a clear night. It feels familiar, close enough to belong to human weather, human calendars, human tides, human stories. But for a radio experiment in the mid-1940s, the moon was not familiar at all. It was a problem of distance, timing, direction, reflection, and loss. The old science fiction imagination had often treated the moon as a destination for bodies. Rockets, travelers, explorers, landings. Project Diana treated it first as a surface for a signal. No one had to go there. No object had to be carried across space. A pulse could make the journey alone. And if that pulse came back, the meaning would be enormous. It would prove that human technology had touched another world without leaving the ground. It would prove that the space between Earth and the moon was not silent in the old sense, not unreachable, not outside experiment. It would show that the same civilization that had filled the air with radio programs, television carriers, radar beams, and fictional invasions could now use radio as a measuring line stretched across the void. This is the point where the larger mystery begins to rearrange itself. The moon did not send back the BBC broadcast from Alexandra Palace. The Long Island recording of 1938 belongs to the atmosphere, to rare propagation, to early television escaping its intended circle. But the moon did send something back later, when asked in the right way. Not memory. Not stored entertainment. Not a lost program. An echo. That distinction makes the story stronger, not weaker. It removes the impossible claim and leaves a chain of real wonders. A London television signal crosses the Atlantic by unusual means. A culture hears invasion in the ordinary grammar of radio drama. Then, at Camp Evans, radio is aimed beyond Earth and returns from the moon itself. One event shows that broadcasts could outrun expectations on Earth. The other shows that deliberate signals could reach into space. At Fort Monmouth, the sky was no longer just the region through which signals wandered unpredictably. It became a target. The moon was no longer only the bright object above the horizon, the old companion of tides and calendars and night travel. It became part of a circuit built by human beings: transmitter, space, lunar surface, receiver. Project Diana begins there, in that transformation. Not with a voice from 1938 coming home after years in darkness, but with a pulse crossing the distance in real time. A pulse launched from New Jersey. A pulse reflected from the moon. A pulse returning after a delay that could be measured, heard, and understood. The story now narrows to a morning in January 1946, when the equipment at Camp Evans sent its signal outward and waited. For a little more than 2 seconds, there was nothing but distance. Then, the distance answered. For a little more than 2 seconds, Camp Evans was listening to space. That is the most important thing to imagine about the morning of the 10th of January, 1946. Not the later recognition. Not the institutional language that would eventually call Project Diana the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. Not even the technical achievement as a completed fact. First, there was the waiting. A radio pulse had been sent from the grounds of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, toward the moon. It had left the equipment at Camp Evans at the speed of light. It had crossed the atmosphere, crossed the region beyond the atmosphere, and gone outward into the cold distance between Earth and its nearest celestial neighbor. Then, if the calculations were right, if the pointing was right, if the signal was strong enough, if the receiving system was sensitive enough, a tiny fraction of that energy would strike the lunar surface and scatter back toward Earth. The echo did not come at once. It could not come at once. That delay was the proof. IEEE reports that the Project Diana radar echo returned about 2.5 seconds after transmission, matching the round-trip light time to the moon. In ordinary human experience, 2.5 seconds is almost nothing. It is the length of a breath held before speaking. It is a short pause in a conversation. It is barely enough time for uncertainty to become discomfort. But on that morning, the pause had a physical size. It was not hesitation. It was not interference. It was not a flaw in a circuit. It was the measured width of the space between Earth and the moon, doubled by the journey out and back. The first successful lunar echo came at about 11:58 in the morning. That time matters because it gives the event a strange ordinariness. It did not happen in mythic darkness, under a dramatic night sky, with the moon hanging visibly over the landscape as a symbol waiting to be touched. It happened near midday, on a January morning in New Jersey, at a military research site that had inherited wartime radar knowledge and was now trying to make that knowledge reach beyond the world it had been built to defend. The war had ended only months earlier. Radar had been one of the decisive technologies of that war, a way of finding aircraft and ships, of turning invisible distance into information. Its pulse and echo logic was already well understood on Earth. Send energy outward. Wait for a return. Measure the delay. Infer the range. But Project Diana extended that familiar logic past every ordinary target. The object was not a plane. It was not a ship. It was not weather, terrain, or a distant coastline. The target was the moon, and the moon answered only after distance had had time to speak. This is why the 2.5-second interval becomes the central sound image of the whole story. Earlier, the mystery had been about a broadcast that escaped its expected world, a BBC television signal from Alexandra Palace meant for a small service area around London, somehow appearing on Long Island in 1938 through unusual propagation. That event had the feeling of a ghost because the image had traveled farther than it was supposed to travel. It seemed to break the boundary drawn around early television. But it was not a lunar return. The moon had not stored the transmission. The moon had not sent back a lost program. Project Diana was different. It was not a misunderstanding dressed as space. It was space entering the measurement. The silence after the pulse was not atmospheric caprice. It was not the ionosphere bending a signal over the horizon. It was the time required for radio energy to go to another world and return. The meaning of the delay was severe and beautiful. If the echo came back too soon, it could not be the moon. If it came back around 2.5 seconds later, then the distance itself agreed with the claim. In that brief pause, the moon became audible as geometry. The experiment did not need a human voice to be dramatic. It did not need music, dialogue, or an announcer describing the future. Its drama was smaller and more exact. A pulse went out. A pulse came back. Between them was a silence that had been measured by the speed of light. For most of human history, the moon had been reached by sight alone. It could be watched, mapped, worshipped, used for calendars, used for navigation, used as a clock in the sky. Telescopes had brought its surface visually closer, turning the bright disk into craters, shadows, and rough terrain. But sight is not touch. A telescope receives light that is already coming. Project Diana changed the direction of the relationship. Earth did not merely look. Earth transmitted. The moon, in this experiment, was not alive, not remembering, not choosing to respond. It was a passive reflector. That distinction is important because it keeps the story in the realm where it becomes more powerful, not less. The moon did not behave like a recorder. It did not hold messages in its dust. It reflected a small part of the energy that reached it, weakly and immediately, in the way physics allowed. The wonder is not that the moon became mysterious. The wonder is that ordinary physical law permitted contact at all. 2.5 seconds is the sound of that law becoming audible. It is also the point where the larger contradiction of our episode begins to settle into its true shape. The 1938 BBC television recording on Long Island showed that Earth's broadcasts could slip beyond their intended limits. It showed that signals could travel strangely, carried or bent by conditions that made the normal horizon unreliable. The Orson Welles broadcast of the War of the Worlds showed that invisible signals could unsettle the imagination, could make the medium itself feel like an opening into catastrophe or revelation. Project Diana did something quieter and more consequential. It gave the imagination a measurement. The echo made the sky less metaphorical. At about 11:58 in the morning on the 10th of January, 1946, the moon was no longer just above Earth in a poetic sense. It was within a circuit. Camp Evans had sent a pulse across the distance and received evidence that the pulse had returned from the lunar surface. IEEE's account of the approximate 2.5-second delay is not a decorative detail. It is the hinge of the event. It is the reason the echo was not merely another signal in a noisy world. It was the timing that identified the path. There is a kind of restraint in that achievement. Nothing visible had to happen in the sky. No rocket rose. No spacecraft crossed the atmosphere. No human being left the ground. The equipment remained in New Jersey. The moon remained where it had always been. Yet the relationship between them changed. A human-made signal had gone outward, touched the lunar surface, and returned to a receiver on Earth. That fact opened a corridor of thought. If the moon could be used as a target, then radar was no longer only terrestrial. If a signal could travel to the moon and back, then radio could become a tool for studying objects beyond Earth. If a weak echo could be detected after such a journey, then communication across space was not fantasy in principle. It was an engineering problem, severe but real. This is why Project Diana stands at the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications in IEEE's recognition. Not because it solved everything that would follow, but because it proved that the path existed. The pause proved the path. It is easy, from the distance of later decades, to let lunar communication feel inevitable. We know that spacecraft would later send telemetry across enormous distances. We know that planetary radar and radio astronomy would become established fields. We know that Arecibo would eventually be used to observe terrestrial radio leakage reflected from the lunar surface. But in January of 1946, the first confirmed echo had the purity of a threshold. It was a yes where there had previously been calculation, hope, and uncertainty. Yes, the signal could leave Earth. Yes, it could reach the moon. Yes, something could come back. And the answer would take about 2.5 seconds. That interval is short enough to fit inside a human room and long enough to contain another world. In a control space at Camp Evans, it would have been experienced as waiting. In physics, it was range. In history, it was a boundary being crossed for the first time in a new way. The delay translated cosmic distance into a form the human nervous system could feel. You did not have to see the miles. You only had to hear the gap. A pulse. Silence. Return. The lost broadcast of 1938 had seemed uncanny because it arrived where it did not belong. Project Diana was uncanny for the opposite reason. It arrived exactly when it should. The timing did not deepen the mystery, it resolved it. The echo's delay matched the round-trip light time to the moon, and in that match was the authority of the event. The moon had not whispered an old television program back to Earth. It had done something more exacting. It had reflected a deliberate signal in real time, and the clock had confirmed the distance. From that morning forward, the moon could be treated not only as an object of observation, but as a reachable surface for radio. Weakly reachable. Indirectly reachable. Reachable only through specialized equipment and careful timing. But reachable. The achievement was not made by the delay alone. Behind that pause stood hardware, wartime radar knowledge, an antenna, modifications, personnel, and calculations that made the attempt possible. The silence between transmission and return is the part the imagination remembers, but the silence had to be engineered. A signal had to be shaped strongly enough to survive the journey. A receiver had to be ready for the faint echo. The moon had to be found not by romance, but by apparatus. The next part of the story belongs to that apparatus, the machine at Camp Evans that threw a signal at the moon, and the people whose names IEEE preserves beside the echo. The echo had a sound in memory, but before it could have a sound, it had a shape. At Camp Evans, on the grounds of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, Project Diana was not a mystery waiting for interpretation. It was a machine assembled around a difficult intention. Radio energy had to be sent outward with enough discipline to cross the space between Earth and the Moon, strike the lunar surface, and return as something still detectable. The achievement later carried a large historical meaning. AIEE recognizes Project Diana as marking the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. But inside that meaning was a much more physical story: modified radar equipment, an antenna array, reflectors, dipoles, and a group of named personnel whose work made the attempt possible. The central instrument of that story was not built from nothing. According to IEEE, Project Diana used modified SCR-271 or SCR-270 radar equipment. That detail matters because it places the experiment in the immediate aftermath of wartime radar development. The Moon Echo was not produced by an elegant observatory built solely for astronomy. It came from radar hardware adapted toward a new target. What had been developed for terrestrial and military purposes was turned upward, away from aircraft and coastlines, toward the nearest celestial body. That shift is easy to understate. Radar, in its wartime use, belonged to urgency, detection, range, and defense. It made invisible distance measurable. It helped operators know that something was present beyond ordinary sight. Project Diana took that same principle and enlarged the field until the target was no longer moving through the air above Earth, but hanging in space. The equipment had to do something familiar in principle and extraordinary in scale: transmit, wait, receive. The difference was the length of the wait and the weakness of the return. The previous chapter stayed with the silence after transmission, that roughly 2.5-second interval reported by IEEE for the first successful lunar echo on the 10th of January, 1946. But silence itself does not prove anything unless the machine on both sides of it can be trusted. The transmitted pulse had to be real. The timing had to be meaningful. The returning signal had to be distinguished from noise, accident, or wishful interpretation. The hardware gave the pause its credibility. Without the equipment, the delay would have been only an idea. With the equipment, it became evidence. IEEE describes the Project Diana antenna as an 8x8 array of half-wave dipoles and reflectors. The phrase is technical, but it has a quiet visual force. An array is not a single wire or a casual aerial raised into the air. It is an organized surface, a deliberate pattern. 8x8 means a grid, a set of repeated elements, each part contributing to a larger whole. The half-wave dipoles were not ornamental pieces. They were the active geometry of transmission and reception, arranged with reflectors so that radio energy could be shaped and directed. In this story, the antenna is the physical answer to the question of aim. To throw a signal at the moon, the experimenters could not treat the sky as a general emptiness. They needed direction. They needed a way to concentrate energy toward a target that, from Earth, appears luminous and familiar, but in radio terms was still a distant and unforgiving reflector. The moon was large in the imagination and small in the beam. It was bright to the eye and faint as a returning radar echo. The array was part of the effort to make the contact possible. There is also something important in the word modified. The SCR-271 or SCR-270 equipment used in Project Diana was not merely switched on and pointed at the sky as if the moon were an ordinary radar target. The notes preserve the fact of modification, and that is enough to tell us that the machine had to be adapted to the experiment. The existing radar apparatus provided a foundation, but the purpose had changed. The target distance was extreme. The returning signal would be weak. The experiment demanded not only power, but patience, alignment, and a receiver ready for a delayed echo from a surface hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. The history can become too clean if we describe it only from the outcome backward. Once the echo is known to have happened, the apparatus can look inevitable. But Project Diana belonged to a moment when the question had not yet become an answer. Could a human-made radio pulse leave Earth, touch the moon, and be detected again? Could the moon function, however weakly, as a passive reflector? Could radar be extended into astronomy? The modified equipment and the 8x8 antenna array were the material form of those questions. IEEE also preserves names beside the achievement, and those names keep the machine from becoming anonymous. Key Project Diana personnel listed by IEEE include John H. DeWitt Jr., E. King Stodola, Jacob Mofsenson, Harold D. Webb, and Herbert Kaufman. The record does not require us to invent private scenes around them. We do not need imagined conversations in the room or dramatic gestures at the instant of return. Their importance is already contained in the association. These were among the people connected by IEEE to the work that made the lunar echo possible. John H. DeWitt Jr. stands in that list as one of the principal names attached to Project Diana. E. King Stodola, Jacob Mofsenson, Harold D. Webb, and Herbert Kaufman stand with him in the IEEE record of personnel. In a story so easily pulled toward the grandeur of the moon, the list brings the scale back down to human responsibility. The echo was celestial in distance, but institutional and technical in origin. It came from a site in New Jersey, from radar knowledge, from equipment altered for a purpose beyond its earlier frame, and from a team whose names remain connected to the experiment. This is where the machinery of Project Diana becomes more than a collection of parts. The modified SCR-271 or SCR-270 radar equipment supplied the electronic basis. The 8x8 array of half-wave dipoles and reflectors supplied the directional structure. Camp Evans supplied the place. Fort Monmouth supplied the larger military and research setting. IEPIE's recognition supplies the later historical frame, the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. Each layer matters because the lunar echo was not a broadcast in the ordinary sense. Alexandra Palace had sent television outward as programming, meant for a small service area, and under unusual conditions, that signal had crossed an ocean. Project Diana sent radio outward as an experiment. Its purpose was not entertainment, news, drama, or public reception. It was a test of whether Earth could actively probe a celestial body with radio and hear the result. That difference separates the lost broadcast from the true moon bounce. The 1938 television image on Long Island was an accident of propagation, an escaped signal carried far beyond its expected range. Project Diana was deliberate. Its signal did not wander into history. It was aimed. It was shaped. It was timed. It was sent toward the moon and awaited with the knowledge that, if it returned, it would come back after the time required for radio waves to make the round trip at the speed of light. The apparatus made the moon into an experimental surface, not a mythic mirror storing old programs, not a cosmic archive holding voices from the past, a reflector, immediate and weak, a body close enough to be reached by radio, far enough to prove that a new kind of communication had begun. After Project Diana, the space between Earth and the moon was no longer only visual or gravitational. It had been crossed by an engineered pulse. And yet machinery alone does not complete the story. A transmitter can be modified. An array can be built. Personnel can assemble, operate, and interpret. But before a faint lunar return can be trusted, someone must ask whether it should be possible at all. The moon echo was not only a hardware problem, it was also a problem of loss, distance, reflection, and detectability. Before the signal was thrown at the moon, the experiment needed mathematics strong enough to justify the attempt. That is where the apparatus gives way to calculation, not away from the machine, but deeper into the reasoning that made the machine worth building. The echo that returned to Camp Evans was physical. The confidence to listen for it began on paper, and the theoretical work that helped show that a signal sent into space might come back weak, but not beyond reach. The apparatus at Camp Evans could be described in metal, wire, and wartime radar parts. But the decision to aim that apparatus at the moon belonged first to a quieter kind of work. Before the modified SCR-271 equipment, before the 8x8 array of half-wave dipoles and reflectors, before the morning when the echo returned, there had to be a calculation. The moon was visible. The distance was known. The speed of radio waves was understood. But understanding those things did not automatically make Project Diana practical. A signal could leave Earth beautifully and still come back too weak to matter. It could spread into space, lose strength across hundreds of thousands of miles, scatter from the lunar surface, and arrive again as nothing more than a trace below the noise. The experiment needed more than ambition. It needed someone to ask whether the echo would be detectable at all. The U.S. Army identifies physicist Walter S. McAfee as the scientist whose theoretical calculations helped determine the feasibility of the Project Diana moon bounce. That sentence is easy to pass over because it does not have the drama of the echo itself. It does not give us the satisfying pause of 2.5 seconds. It does not produce the image of a radar beam crossing the dark. But it is one of the crucial hidden hinges of the story. McAfee's role places mathematics before contact. It reminds us that the first lunar echo was not simply attempted and then luckily heard. It was reasoned toward. McAfee worked at the Army Signal Corps Radar Laboratory at Camp Evans on the grounds of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. In that setting, the moon was not a symbol or a mythic object. It was a target with dimensions, distance, and reflective properties. The question was not whether radio waves could travel through space. They could. The question was whether enough of the transmitted energy could survive the full round trip to become a measurable return. That question sits at the center of every moon bounce experiment. A radio pulse leaves a transmitter and expands outward. Even if the antenna gives the pulse direction, the energy weakens as distance increases. At the moon, the signal does not strike a polished mirror. The lunar surface acts as a passive reflector, sending back only a small portion of what arrives. Then that faint return must cross the same great distance again, spreading and weakening on the way back to Earth. By the time it reaches the receiving equipment, it is no longer a bold, outgoing transmission. It is a whisper of the original pulse. This was the kind of whisper Project Diana had to predict before it could hear. In the larger public memory of the experiment, the echo can seem almost inevitable. We know now that on the 10th of January, 1946, at about 11:58 in the morning, the signal returned after about 2.5 seconds. IEEE later recognized Project Diana as marking the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. From that distance, history can compress the work into a clean sequence. Equipment built, pulse sent, moon reached, Echo received. But feasibility does not feel clean when it is still uncertain. Before the successful return, there was no confirmed American lunar radar echo waiting in the record to reassure the team. There was hardware adapted from war. There were people at Camp Evans capable of building and operating it. There was a celestial body moving across the sky. And there was a problem that had to be made small enough for engineering to attack. McAfee's theoretical work mattered because it transformed the moon from an unreachable idea into a calculable radio object. The calculations did not make the echo strong. They did not make the moon closer. They did not remove the losses imposed by distance. But they helped determine whether the faint return should still fall within the reach of the equipment at Camp Evans. That is a subtle but powerful kind of permission. Not permission in the bureaucratic sense, but permission in the scientific sense, the moment when an experiment stops being fantasy and becomes difficult. Difficult can be built. Difficult can be scheduled. Difficult can be aimed. Impossible cannot. In this story, mathematics becomes a form of listening before the receiver is even turned toward the sky. It asks in advance what the ear might hear. It estimates the strength of the outgoing pulse, the loss over the path to the moon, the small fraction reflected, the loss again on the path home, and the ability of the receiving system to distinguish the return. It does not need the romance of certainty. It only needs to show that the echo is not beyond reach. That distinction is important for the whole chain of events we have been following. The 1938 BBC television images on Long Island had arrived by an unusual path through the ionosphere, or related atmospheric and solar conditions. That earlier signal had crossed the Atlantic in a way that seemed to mock its intended local range. It was not planned as a lunar experiment. It was not bounced from the moon. It was an escape, a physical accident turned into rare evidence on 16mm film. Project Diana was different. It was not waiting for the atmosphere to perform a trick. It was not asking whether a broadcast might wander farther than expected. It was asking whether human-made radio energy could be deliberately sent to another world and received again. The surprise was not that a signal had slipped away. The achievement was that a signal had been aimed, timed, and recognized after returning from the moon. McAfee's contribution belongs to that change in attitude. The radio world was moving from accidental reach to deliberate reach. In the early television story, the strange fact was that a local service from Alexandra Palace could be seen across the ocean under unusual conditions. At Camp Evans, the question became more severe and more ambitious. Could engineers make the Earth speak to the moon on purpose? The answer required machinery, but it also required trust in the numbers. John H. DeWitt Jr., E. King Stadola, Jacob Moffinson, Harold D. Webb, Herbert Kaufman, and others named by IEEE stand near the apparatus and the operation of Project Diana. McAfee stands near the reasoning that helped show the apparatus was worth pointing upward. The distinction is not a hierarchy. It is a system. The array needed the calculation. The calculation needed the array. The echo belonged to both. There is something almost cinematic in imagining the work before the transmission, not as a dramatic scene of revelation, but as the steady narrowing of doubt. The moon is far away, but not infinitely far. The signal will weaken, but not vanish entirely. The surface will reflect poorly, but not absolutely fail. The receiver will face noise, but perhaps the return will still rise enough to be detected. Each clause is cautious. Each clause removes a little darkness from the problem. And then, on the morning of the successful test, those abstract losses became a lived interval. The pulse left New Jersey. The operators waited. About 2.5 seconds later, the return matched the round-trip light time to the moon. What had been calculated as a possibility appeared as an echo. The mathematics had not replaced the experiment. It had prepared the experiment to recognize its own success. That recognition is essential. A faint signal returning from space is not meaningful simply because a trace appears. It becomes meaningful when the trace fits the predicted delay, the expected geometry, and the known behavior of radio waves. Without calculation, an echo can be mistaken for noise. With calculation, noise can be interrogated until one small feature becomes evidence. So Walter S. McAfee's place in the Project Diana story is not decorative. It is structural. The U.S. Army's identification of his theoretical calculations restores a necessary layer to the achievement. It tells us that the moon echo began before the transmitter fired. It began when the physical world was reduced, carefully and honestly, to quantities that could be tested. The moon, in this chapter of the story, is still only a passive reflector. It is not storing broadcasts. It is not returning memories years later. It is not answering with intention. But after Project Diana, it had become something new in human technology, a surface that could be used in a measured radio path between Earth and space. Once that idea existed, later scientists could reverse the imagination. If Earth could send a signal to the moon and hear it come back, then perhaps the moon could also be used as a mirror for the signals Earth was already leaking into space. Decades after Camp Evans, that thought would lead to a much larger ear in Puerto Rico, where the 305-meter Arecibo radio telescope would look toward the moon and listen not for one military radar pulse, but for the radio signature of Earth itself. Decades after Camp Evans, the experiment had changed scale, but not its essential honesty. A signal could leave Earth, touch the moon, and return. Project Diana had proved that with a deliberate pulse, a calculated path, and a receiver waiting through the short silence of space. But by the late 1970s, the question had become quieter and stranger. What if the signal was not deliberately sent toward the moon at all? What if it was simply leaking from Earth, spilling upward from television transmitters, military systems, and the ordinary machinery of a radio civilization? In December 1978, Sullivan and Knowles used the 305-meter Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico to listen for exactly that. They were not trying to recover a lost program from the past. They were not asking the moon to behave like an archive. They were using it as a mirror. The mirror was weak, natural, and passive. It did not remember. It did not choose. It did not preserve a broadcast from one decade and return it in another. It reflected radio energy in the same practical sense that had made moonbounce possible after the war. But now the purpose was inverted. Instead of sending a pulse outward and waiting for its echo, Sullivan and Knowles turned a great radio telescope toward the lunar surface and tried to detect the combined radio leakage of Earth after it had struck the moon and scattered back. The geometry was elegant because it made the moon into a tool for seeing ourselves. From Earth, the moon is a familiar disk in the sky. From the moon, Earth is the bright radio object. Our planet turns beneath its atmosphere, its continents and oceans carrying transmitters through space. Some of those transmissions are aimed locally. Some are intended for aircraft, ships, radar targets, television receivers, military purposes, or regional audiences. But radio waves are not confined by human intention. A fraction escapes. It rises beyond towers and horizons, beyond the immediate service areas for which it was engineered, and continues outward. If that escaping energy happens to strike the lunar surface, a tiny part of it can be reflected. The moon becomes a passive reflector. Arecibo, aimed at the moon, can then receive not a message from the moon, but a faint version of Earth's own radio signature after one extra step in its path. The route is simple to imagine and difficult to measure. A transmitter on Earth radiates energy. Some of that energy travels toward the moon. It reaches the lunar surface. The surface scatters a portion of it back into space. Arecibo listens from Puerto Rico, catching what it can of the reflected signal. In that arrangement, the telescope is not looking past the moon. It is looking at the moon in order to hear Earth. That reversal matters. For much of the story, Earth had been the place where signals were received. Alexandra Palace transmitted. Long Island listened. Camp Evans transmitted. Camp Evans listened again. In each case, the path was dramatic because it crossed an unexpected distance. But Sullivan and Knowles brought another perspective into the story. Earth itself could be treated as an object of observation, not as a globe seen by cameras, and not as a planet described by weather or geology, but as a radio source. Arecibo was suited to that kind of listening because it was enormous. Its 305-meter dish, built into the landscape of Puerto Rico, had a collecting area far beyond ordinary antennas. For weak radio astronomy, size matters. The signal reflected from the moon was not a clean, powerful broadcast arriving directly from a nearby tower. It was leakage, already diluted by distance, reflected by a body that was never designed to be a reflector, and then spread again on the return path. By the time it reached the receiver, it was an extremely faint clue. But Arecibo's power came with a constraint. The telescope was not a steerable dish mounted freely in the open air. Its great collecting surface was fixed into the ground. It could observe only within about 20 degrees of the zenith. That means it could not simply point anywhere in the sky at any time. The target had to pass through a limited observing window overhead. For Sullivan and Knowles, this shaped the experiment. The moon had to be in the part of the sky Arecibo could reach. The geometry was not only Earth to moon to telescope. It was Earth to moon to telescope through the narrow permissions of a fixed instrument on a rotating planet. This limitation gives the scene its quiet tension. The moon is large in human imagination, but small as a target for a constrained observatory. Arecibo could not chase it across the entire sky. It had to wait for the moon to come into the available region, near enough to the zenith for the telescope to observe. The experiment was therefore not only about sensitivity, but timing. The Earth turned. The moon moved. The radio transmitters on Earth kept radiating. The telescope had its window. For a short interval, the geometry aligned. The December 1978 observations also carried an additional subtlety. Sullivan and Knowles' observing geometry emphasized television transmitters near Earth's limb as seen from the moon. That phrase sounds almost visual, but it describes a radio perspective. Imagine standing on the moon and looking back at Earth. The limb is the edge of the planet's disk, the curved boundary between Earth and space. Transmitters near that edge, from the moon's point of view, could contribute strongly to the leakage being sampled in this reflected path. The experiment was not just collecting a vague planetary glow. It was shaped by where transmitters were located on the turning Earth, how their radiation escaped, and what portions of that escaping energy could illuminate the moon. This is where the story begins to move from moon bounce into planetary self-portraiture. Project Diana used the moon to prove that a radio path could be made across space. Sullivan and Knowles used the moon to ask what Earth sounded like when heard indirectly. The result was not a program, not a voice, not a single lost television image. It was a way of sampling the radio face of a technological planet. That distinction is important for the larger mystery. The 1938 BBC television signal recorded on Long Island did not come back from the moon. The best explanation remains unusual long-distance propagation through the ionosphere or related atmospheric and solar conditions. But the later Arecibo work shows why the lunar version of the myth feels so tempting. The moon really can return Earth's radio energy. It really can act as a passive mirror. And ordinary terrestrial transmissions really do leak away from the planet, travel into space, and become detectable under the right circumstances with the right instrument. The difference lies in time and mechanism. The moon does not hold a broadcast for 40 years. It reflects what arrives, weekly and almost immediately, according to geometry and physics. The reflection is not memory. It is path. It is a line drawn from Earth to the lunar surface and back again. Still, there is something almost uncanny in the Arecibo experiment. To listen to Earth by looking at the moon is to turn the planet into a subject. It suggests an outside viewpoint, as though civilization has become bright enough in radio to be noticed, not only by its intended audience, but by instruments that treat it as an astronomical phenomenon. A television transmitter, built to serve viewers on the ground, may also be part of a larger, unintended signature. A radar system designed for defense or detection may also contribute to the radio brightness of Earth. The planet becomes an accidental broadcaster. In December 1978, Arecibo did not need the moon to speak. It needed the moon to reflect. The telescope listened through that reflection and found a way to measure the signals Earth was losing to space. The old dream of a broadcast returning from the lunar surface was still wrong as an explanation for the Long Island recording. But as a scientific possibility, stripped of folklore and placed inside careful observing geometry, the idea had become real in another form. The moon was not a vault of vanished programs. It was a dull mirror in the sky. And in that mirror, Sullivan and Knowles could begin to see the radio outline of modern Earth. Not one signal, not one station, but a crowded mixture of transmitters, radars, carriers, powers, and frequencies. The next question was no longer whether Earth leaked. It was what, exactly, made the planet brightest. What made the planet brightest was not the romantic image of one lost program wandering through space. It was something broader, more industrial, and in its way, more revealing. When Sullivan and Knowles used the 305-meter Arecibo radio telescope to study terrestrial radio leakage reflected from the moon, they were not searching for a single ghost from broadcasting history. They were asking what Earth looked like in radio light when seen indirectly, by way of a lunar mirror. The answer was not quiet. In the frequency range from 150 to 500 megahertz, Sullivan and Knowles found that two kinds of human transmitters mattered especially: military radars and television transmitters. These were not hidden whispers. They were part of the working machinery of the late 20th century, built for practical purposes on Earth, aimed according to terrestrial needs, and yet capable of becoming part of the planet's outward-facing signature. This is the crucial shift in the story. A radio or television transmitter is usually imagined from the ground up. A tower serves a city. A radar watches a horizon. A broadcast station covers an assigned region. The engineering language is local, national, operational. But radio waves do not know where a border ends. If power is radiated upward, or scattered, or sent through a beam that is not perfectly confined, some portion of it can leave the immediate human audience behind. It can rise above the intended service area. It can pass through the atmosphere. It can cross the distance to the moon, strike that rough surface, and return faintly enough that only an instrument like Arecibo could notice. Sullivan and Knowles were measuring that unintended overflow. They were listening to Earth by listening to what Earth had failed to keep to itself. Television was especially important because television transmitters were powerful, widespread, and spectrally distinctive. A television station was not just a cultural institution, not just a schedule of entertainment, news, sport, and ceremony. In radio terms, it was also a physical source, a carrier, a frequency, an effective radiated power, a pattern in the electromagnetic environment. Its signal was designed to carry images to receivers on Earth, but the same technical features that made it receivable across a service area also made it visible, in principle, to radio astronomy. For the lunar reflection calculations discussed by Sullivan and Knowles, typical television transmitter effective radiated powers were in the range of 100 to 1,000 kilowatts. Those numbers matter because the moon is a poor mirror and space is very large. A signal traveling from Earth to the moon spreads. The reflected part is weak. The returning energy spreads again. By the time it reaches a receiver on Earth, it is no longer a broadcast in the everyday sense. It is a trace, a remnant of power after distance has done almost everything it can to erase it. And yet, with enough transmitted power, a narrow enough spectral feature, and a sensitive enough receiving system, the trace could be detected. Sullivan and Knowles also discussed television video carriers with widths around 0.1 to 1 hertz. That detail is easy to pass over, but it is one of the reasons television could stand out. A narrow carrier concentrates energy into a very small part of the spectrum. Against the broad background of natural radio noise and the mixed emissions of human technology, narrowness becomes a kind of signature. It is not a message in the narrative sense. It does not say who built the transmitter, or what the evening program was, or what face appeared on a screen. But it can announce artificial order. It can say, in physics rather than language, that something technological is operating on the planet below. This is where the story of the lost broadcast becomes larger than the 1938 film from Long Island. The BBC images from Alexandra Palace were fragile, distorted, and local in intention, carried across the Atlantic by unusual propagation rather than by the moon. But 4 decades later, the world they foreshadowed had expanded. Television was no longer a rare experiment from a mast above London. It had become a dense layer of transmitters, frequencies, and power across the surface of Earth. The medium that once vanished as soon as it was performed had become part of the planet's radio face. Military radars formed the other major contribution in the same frequency range. Their role carried a different emotional weight. Television leaked culture, images, carriers, schedules, ordinary life converted into electromagnetic form. Radar leaked vigilance. It came from systems built to detect, track, measure, and defend. In the decades after the Second World War, radar had become one of the defining technologies of the radio planet. Its signals could be strong, directional, and purposeful. They were not intended as greetings to space, but they were powerful enough to matter in the accounting of what Earth radiated away. Placed together, television transmitters and military radars made a strange portrait. One part of Earth was broadcasting entertainment and public information. Another part was scanning for danger. Both were producing radio energy. Both were shaping what a distant observer might detect. The planet's accidental signature was not the product of one desire, but of many systems operating at once: civil, military, commercial, scientific, and domestic. That is why Sullivan and Knowles' work matters so deeply to this chain of events. It does not simply prove that Earth leaks radio energy. It begins to characterize the leakage. It asks what kinds of transmitters dominate, what frequencies are involved, how power and bandwidth affect detectability, and how the moon can be used as a passive reflector to sample the result. Arecibo did not need to recover a particular program. It could measure the composite evidence of technological civilization. The moon, in this role, becomes almost austere. It does not remember. It does not store. It does not choose one broadcast over another. It reflects what reaches it, weakly and immediately, according to geometry and surface properties. The meaning comes from Earth. The moon is only the instrument by which Earth briefly becomes visible to itself from the outside. And that outside perspective is unsettling because it reverses the usual human imagination of broadcasting. For most of the 20th century, radio and television were inward-facing miracles. They collapsed distance between cities, carried voices into kitchens, placed images in living rooms, gave nations shared moments in real time. But the same infrastructure also made Earth less silent to space. Without ceremony, without a single world decision, human technology began drawing a radio outline around the planet. In the 150 to 500 megahertz range, that outline was shaped strongly by military radars and television transmitters. Not by deliberate interstellar messages, not by a beacon built to announce humanity, by ordinary and strategic systems doing their assigned work. A radar pulse, a television carrier, a transmitter feeding a region, a beam crossing sky, a portion of energy that did not stop at the audience. This is the accidental broadcaster, Earth not as a single station, but as a rotating body covered with emitters. Some pointed outward by design, some by geometry, some by imperfection, some simply because radio propagation is never confined to human intention. From the lunar surface, those emissions could be reflected back. From a sufficiently distant place, they might form part of what makes Earth detectable as a technological world. The early BBC engineers at Alexandra Palace had not set out to change the radio identity of the planet. The RCA engineers on Long Island had not recorded proof that the moon was returning an old program. Project Diana had not recovered vanished television from space. And Sullivan and Knowles were not chasing folklore when they pointed Arecibo toward the moon in December 1978. Each step was more precise than the myth, and for that reason, more powerful. The real story is not that one broadcast was stored in the sky. It is that broadcasting itself changed Earth. First, a local signal escaped its expected boundary. Then, a deliberate radar pulse proved that the moon could return human radio energy. Then Arecibo showed that the everyday transmitters of the modern world had become detectable by reflection, with television and military radar among the brightest contributors in a key band of the spectrum. The planet had acquired a radio face, and once that is understood, the central mystery can be resolved without being diminished. The moon did not have to preserve a 1938 television program for the story to remain haunting. The haunting part is that Earth was never as radio private as it imagined. Its signals could bend, scatter, reflect, and leak. Its images and instruments could exceed their intended range. Its technologies could become part of a larger environment, one that extended beyond towers, cities, coasts, and nations. The lost broadcast was not waiting in lunar memory. But the moon did help reveal something just as strange, that Earth itself had been speaking outward all along. That is where the myth can finally be set down carefully. Not dismissed, not mocked, set down. Because the story that survived in fragments was built from real pieces. There really was a BBC television signal from Alexandra Palace in London. There really was a recording made on Long Island in 1938. There really was a moon echo, later, from Camp Evans at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And there really were observations from Arecibo in Puerto Rico showing that the moon could reflect the radio leakage of Earth itself. The error was never that the ingredients were false. The error was in placing them in the wrong order and giving the moon the wrong role. The moon did not store a 1938 BBC broadcast and return it decades later. It was not a celestial archive. It was not a tape recorder circling Earth in silence. Radio waves do not wait there in a vault of dust and crater shadow, holding their pictures until some later century learns how to ask for them back. The real story is more precise and in some ways more unsettling. The Alexandra Palace signal that reached Long Island belonged to an earlier kind of miracle. It came from a service designed for a small world. The BBC's high-definition television station at Alexandra Palace had been built to serve London and its nearby surroundings. Its pictures were meant for receivers within ordinary reach of the transmitter, not for an ocean away. The mast above Ali Pali was tall, the engineering ambitious, the achievement extraordinary, but the intended audience was local. And yet, in 1938, RCA engineers on Long Island captured something from that small London service. The surviving 16mm film does not look like a clean triumph. It looks damaged by distance. The image fades. It distorts. It trembles with the instability of a signal that has no right to be so far from home. That is part of its evidential power. It is not the look of a polished relay. It is the look of a transmission pulled through difficult conditions, saved almost accidentally by engineers who had built an enormous receiving arrangement and were patient enough to listen. The best explanation is not lunar reflection. It is unusual long-distance propagation through the ionosphere, or related atmospheric and solar conditions. That explanation may feel less cinematic at first because it removes the moon from the 1938 recording. But it does not make the event ordinary. It replaces fantasy with a stranger kind of physics. A broadcast that should have faded beyond its horizon was carried far outside its intended range. The sky itself became part of the circuit. Layers high above Earth, shaped by solar activity and atmospheric conditions, allowed a local television signal to appear on the far side of the Atlantic. So the first answer is this. The 1938 broadcast crossed the ocean through the behavior of Earth's upper atmosphere, not because the moon sent it back. But the moon enters the story truthfully soon after. On the 10th of January, 1946, at Camp Evans, Project Diana showed that radio energy could leave Earth, strike the lunar surface, and return. The U.S. Army Signal Corps experiment was not recovering old television. It was sending a deliberate radar pulse into space and waiting for its echo. IEEE records that the return came after about 2.5 seconds, the time required for a radio signal traveling at the speed of light to go to the moon and back. That pause changed the meaning of the sky. Before Project Diana, the moon could be looked at, photographed, measured, and imagined. After Project Diana, it could be touched by radio and heard in return. The experiment helped mark the beginning of radar astronomy and space communications. It showed that a human-made signal could cross the distance to another world and come back weak, delayed, but detectable. The moon in that experiment was not a mind, not a library, not a sender with intention. It was a reflector. That distinction matters. A reflector does not remember. It answers almost immediately, according to distance in physics. It gives back a fraction of what reaches it. The beauty of Project Diana lies in that restraint. There is no supernatural storage, no hidden message, no lost program reappearing out of lunar memory. There is only a pulse, a path, a surface, a delay, and a receiver sensitive enough to notice the return. Then, decades later, Arecibo gave the story its last and widest frame. In December 1978, Sullivan and Knowles used the 305-meter Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico to observe terrestrial radio leakage reflected from the lunar surface. This was not the same as Project Diana's single deliberate pulse. It was more like holding up a mirror to the planet's own unintended emissions. The moon became a passive reflector again, but now what it reflected was not one planned experiment. It reflected part of the radio environment Earth had made around itself. The finding was not that one famous broadcast had survived. It was that Earth had become loud. In the 150 to 500 megahertz range, Sullivan and Knowles found that military radars and television transmitters were major contributors to the planet's radio leakage. The details are technical, but the implication is simple. A civilization does not need to aim every signal into space in order to become visible by radio. Some of its technologies leak. Some radiate. Some point upward by design or by accident. Some spill past the horizon of their original purpose. Television, built for homes and cities, had become part of Earth's larger signature. Military radar, built for surveillance and defense, had done the same. From far enough away, intention begins to blur. A broadcast meant for viewers, a radar beam meant for detection, a carrier wave holding a channel steady, all of them become features of a planet surrounded by technology. They become the accidental weather of a radio civilization. That is why the myth lasted. It compressed a complicated truth into a single haunting image, the moon sending back an old broadcast. The image is wrong, but it points towards something real. Human signals do escape. Human signals can travel farther than their makers planned. The moon can reflect them. A sensitive instrument can use that reflection to study what Earth is emitting. And the early age of broadcasting, even when it imagined itself local, was already beginning to loosen signals into a larger universe. The real chain is delicate. Alexandra Palace transmitted live pictures into the London air. Under unusual conditions, one of those signals crossed the Atlantic and reached Long Island. Years later, Project Diana proved that radio could be bounced deliberately from the moon. Decades after that, Arecibo showed that Earth's own leakage, including television transmitters and military radars, could be sampled by looking at the lunar surface. Not one miracle, then. A sequence: leakage, propagation, reflection, detection. Each step smaller than the legend, but stronger because it is true. And there is something fitting about that. Early television was a medium of disappearance. Much of it was live. Much of it was not preserved. Performances passed through cameras, transmitters, aerials, and receivers, then vanished. The 16mm Long Island recording matters because it caught a ghost of that vanishing world, not from the moon, but from a screen receiving a signal that had traveled impossibly far by terrestrial standards. The moon's role came later, as a mirror for another kind of vanishing. Not the loss of a single program, but the loss of Earth's radio privacy. Once our transmitters became powerful enough, once our radars and television carriers filled the spectrum, Earth stopped being silent beyond itself. Not in the dramatic way imagined by science fiction, with a message addressed to the stars, but in the quieter way technology usually changes the world. By doing ordinary things at large scale. By broadcasting news, entertainment, aircraft detection, defense, routine signals, daily signals. By filling the near space around the planet with evidence that something here was building machines and pushing energy into the sky. So the answer to the central mystery is not, the moon sent back our first broadcast. It is this: our first broadcasts were less contained than we believed. One of them escaped across the Atlantic through the ionosphere. Later, we learned to strike the moon with radar and hear the echo. Later still, we learned that the moon could reflect the accumulated radio noise of Earth back toward our instruments, revealing a planet that had become detectable through its own activity. The legend gives the moon a memory. The science gives Earth a voice. And perhaps that is the more haunting ending. Not that a lost television program waited for us in lunar dust, but that from the beginning of the electronic age, our signals were already leaving traces. Some bent back, some scattered, some reflected, some moved outward, growing weaker with distance, carrying no promise of being understood. The first images from Alexandra Palace were meant for a small audience near London, but radio does not always respect the size of the world imagined by its engineers. A signal can leave a mast, cross a city, climb into the upper atmosphere, slip beyond its planned border, and arrive where no viewer was supposed to be waiting. A radar pulse can leave New Jersey, touch the moon, and return after 2.5 seconds with proof of distance. The great dish at Arecibo can look at the lunar surface and find, in its reflection, the outline of a technological Earth. So we do not need the moon to be an archive. It is enough that it was there, bright, silent, and reflective, while Earth learned to speak in waves. And somewhere in that chain of escaped broadcasts, delayed echoes, and accidental planetary signatures, the myth becomes something better than a falsehood. It becomes a way of noticing what really happened. The moon did not send back 1938, but it helped show us that 1938 and everything after it had already begun to travel.